Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. Welcome to this latest end-of-season wrap-up of Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. We've now completed 8 seasons of the pod, and this greatest hits episode is the 58th we Agents of Insights have shared with the world in the past 2.5 years. The onward rush of AI, flowing like quicksilver into every corner and crevice of our professional and personal lives, has been growing in volume as a signature drumbeat on the podcast. This is no surprise, given the flywheel effect of AI and machine learning building quickly and iteratively on every new innovation in the space, and the fact that all models are built on a vast array of data. At the time of recording this greatest hits episodes of Seasons 8, OpenAI had just rolled out GPT-5, with claims of PhD-level expertise on every topic. So, plenty of scope for malarkey there. Minor corrections for sure, and almost certainly major corrections too. Chris Summerfield is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Oxford. And before taking up that post a couple of years ago, he had a long and distinguished career at Google DeepMind. He's the author of an excellent non-specialist, largely jargon-free book from March 2025 called These Strange New Minds: How AI Learned to Talk and What It Means. Of all the commentators and experts in the field of AI, I found Chris to be one of the clearest, most positive, and least scaremongery around. He explained to me how large language models' ways of working, simply predict the next token, is remarkably similar to human thinking. And you argue that prediction is at the heart of both LLMs and also human intelligence. Could you just unpack a little bit about how just predicting, I mean, in the case of LLMs, predict the next token, but how just predicting actually gets large language models surprisingly close to something that we might call thinking?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, nobody quite knows the answer to that question, but I can give you some version of it. So, kind of if you wanted to take a kind of deflationary stance about current AI, then one way that you might do that is by kind of appealing to the simplicity or the apparent inadequacy of the mechanism that the model has for learning new information. And that mechanism is very, very simple. It predicts what's going to happen next in the world and then adjusts the weights, parameters of the network to make a better prediction next time. And that's something that a class of machine learning tool that's often called a generative model, that's what it's trained to do. And of course, why would we think that that's inadequate? Well, we probably think that's inadequate because it reflects just one of the different ways that you could conceive of an agent learning, right? Of course, we learn in lots of other ways. We learn, by forming goals and seeking to achieve those goals by trying things out in the world. We learn based on the value of the reinforcement value. We learn by teaching each other. We learn by, thinking abstractly and reading books and all of these things. And it's very easy to say, well, how on earth could you ever acquire intelligence by just trying to predict whatever comes next? And, that sounds very reasonable. But if you think about it, so from a neuroscience standpoint, there's just a fundamental principle, which is that if you want to learn something, not the only way, but basically the most effective way to learn something is always going to be to have a guess and to kind of correct that guess a little bit in the right direction on the basis of the information that you get. And actually, even many of those other types of learning that we're talking about, if you think about reward learning, that's also how we learn from rewards. If you think about playing tennis, right? You start out and you're really bad and the ball goes everywhere and you get all of this negative feedback and you gradually adjust your tennis swing until you're, Bjorn Borg or Novak Djokovic or whoever, if you do it enough. And the same is true in almost every domain. And the brain mechanisms which allow learning are themselves based on fundamentally based on predictive mechanisms. So you get a bit of information and you try and work out what's missing or what's coming next. And the brain does that and it gradually adjusts. So, prediction does sound overly simplistic, but at the same time, it's basically how the brain works.
Chris went on to pinpoint several further ways in which human and machine cognition are similar, but critically, ways in which they're different too. Here he eloquently considers similarities and differences in terms of physical structures, behaviors, and motivation.
Yeah, so what's similar? I mean, I think, structurally, there are similarities and differences, right? So if you think about the structure, so the brain is fundamentally a neural network, and the architectures which, power modern deep learning are neural networks. So, neural networks consist of like sets of units which encode, they encode values, which in the brain is sort of like how much activity is being generated. And in a neural network, artificial neural network is just a number. And those units are connected together by connections that have variable strength. And in neural networks, those are weights, and those weights are, again, just numbers that dictate those strengths. And in the brain, they're synapses, and there are a number of factors that dictate synaptic efficacy, but broadly they boil down to various forms, like how many receptors there are and how vigorously they're released, right? Which is determined by various protein synthesis mechanisms. So there's a similarity, there's a structural similarity. But there's also a big structural difference, which is that, if you think about the way that particularly transformer networks, which are the sort of the workhorse of modern deep learning, particularly large language models, the way they work and the way the brain works, like the dynamics of activity are incredibly different. So, transformers, what they do broadly is they take some information, they sort of very cleverly learn kind of like what goes with what. So the weights are sort of roughly encoding some sense of what goes with what, and then they make a prediction about the next thing. So through the network, there's just one sweep of information, input through to output. The brain is not like that. The brain is recurrent. So what that recurrence means is that their patterns of activity in neural networks become like they display interesting dynamics. They are self-sustaining in many ways. So, neurons will excite neurons that will excite other neurons that will excite those first neurons in the first. And so you get these loops of activation. So from a physical standpoint, there are both similarities and differences. And I think, from when you look at a behavioral standpoint, you can also see similarities and differences. So much of the similarity, I think, is in the fact that although the brain is a neural network, which is kind of messy and entangled and has these weird kind of dynamics, it's able to engage in very, very, very structured forms of reasoning. So it's able to retrieve knowledge and make logical inferences, like, knowing, for example, that if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then you know for free that A is greater than C, right? That type of inference, which is called transitive inference, that type of inference is something which you can't just memorize it because nobody ever told you about the difference between A and C. You have to infer it from the data. And sort of magically, even though the brain is a mess, what comes out is highly structured and sensible. And neural networks is exactly the same, right? So despite the fact that the GPT-4 or your favorite language model has millions of parameters, nobody understands what's going on inside it. And yet, like, what you get out is these very structured forms of behavior. So there's a lot of similarity at the behavioral level. There's also a dissimilarity at the behavioral level. Dissimilarity at the behavioral level is like, when I wake up in the morning, I have a plan. It's like, I've got stuff to do and I try to spend my day doing it. That is not true for current language models. So current language models, they just sit there and, if you query them, then they will respond because they're like autoregressive sequence predictors. But they don't have motivations. They don't have goals. They don't sort of intrinsically generate ideas about what they should and should not do and then seek to pursue them. But we do, and we do because we have to, because otherwise we wouldn't stay alive. So, as always, there are ways, if you wanted to make a case that neural networks and humans were totally dissimilar, there would be lots of information you could draw upon. But if you also wanted to make a case that they were similar, you equally would have, the world's your oyster in terms of information.
I commend Chris's episode to AI skeptics and evangelists alike. I found our discussion to be a welcome breath of fresh air, and untainted air at that, and an evidence-based riposte to the growing army of Luddite doommongers about all things AI. What I particularly like about his practical, evidence-based approach is that he doesn't, to quote a former favourite boss, Mike Greenlees, smoke his own Kool-Aid. Don't get me wrong. I'm not some starry-eyed fan of the new, happy to welcome in every innovation for innovation's sake. I've repeatedly been on the record as a vocal opponent of social and digital media platforms whose free services turn we consumers into the product, whose fuel is our dopamine, and whose currency our attention, with never a second thought for the impact on our mental health. As well as focusing indeed on the upsides and potential in our ever more digital, data and AI-infused lives, Season 8 is also very much about the enduring importance of humanity and doing things in real life. This is a common theme that we've touched on and explored with contributors to Data Malarkey before, including Consciously Digital's Anastasia Dedyukina from Season 1 in May 2023, and Sussex University's Professor of Kindness, Robin Banerjee, from Season 7 in March of this year. Christine Rosen is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Indeed, I first met and spoke to Christine when she was sharing a platform at Charleston Festival in East Sussex in the south of England earlier this year, sharing that platform with none other than Oxford's Chris Summerfield. Christine is the author of a very different book, The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World. In the book and our conversation, she presents a wealth of evidence that demonstrates that doing things IRL and not mediated through a screen is typically richer, more rounded, and more complete. Here she explains the very real negative impact of living a mediated life on emotional processing and understanding. On emotion, are those who live mediated lives, do you know this, are those who live mediated lives less able to distinguish between the facial characteristics, the facial expressions of emotion?
Yes, from what we've seen, particularly in studies of young people who spend a lot of time in mediated environments looking at screens, they have a hard time doing two things. One, describing what they see others' faces revealing about their emotions, but even more worrisome, identifying their own emotions. And one example I'll give is, and this is pretty common for anyone who knows teenagers and teenagers who use smartphones and social media a lot, that constant ability to distract. And this includes whether you're in a boardroom or you're in a classroom and you're bored and you pull out your phone. If you never have to sit with discomfort, if you never have to sit and identify, is this anger? Is this fear? Is this sadness? What am I feeling right now that makes me uncomfortable? If what you can do is escape that moment of boredom in a meeting or overwhelming emotion when your friend has said something you don't like, then you never have to sit and deal with it and you never have to identify it. And we are seeing this particularly in the young. And it is likely one of the reasons why we've seen increases in mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. Learning to identify and process and health in a healthy way, deal with one's emotions is part of becoming a grown-up. It's part of becoming a fully developed human person and actually a person who can flourish as a human being. And one of the things that these technologies offer us is this very seductive notion that you never really should have to do that. You can make all of your life convenient, seamless, efficient. These are the terms that you often see in advertisements for the product. But humans are messy. We have a lot of messy emotions. We are incredibly delusional about our own experiences and emotions. It's what allows us to get up every day and look at ourselves in the mirror. But those strategies for coping and developing a healthy sense, an emotional sense of self, that gets derailed, particularly in the young, if they can either distract or filter their emotions through devices that give them total control over their own and others' presence. So if I don't like something you're saying, I could just delete, or I could be like, oops, sorry, my connection's cut off. And these sorts of strategies actually over time become habits. So to the CEO who's, very importantly looking at whatever, text message they might be getting during a meeting, it's also a status marker. It's like, I don't have to listen to you. I have more important things in my time. It's why I think, to your point earlier about artists and musicians, the really smart ones now who can afford to do so are banning phones for a reason. It's because their experience of performance is completely changed when they're just seeing a sea of phones rather than a sea of faces. You think I've spoken to stand-up comics who talk about the difference between doing a set where they're working out new material when everybody's recording it and when no one's allowed to have a phone. And when no one has a phone, they can more quickly get their rhythm and figure out if a joke is landing or how the mood of the audience. Those are really important connections that we have in artistic performance, but also in our work lives, and most importantly, in our intimate lives with others. If a husband and wife are having a difficult, discussion and someone picks up a phone, That is a far more important gesture at that point in time than if they're just sitting on a bus waiting for the bus to pull away from the station. So all of those things matter. And I think we forget, again, qualitatively they matter. They're difficult to measure quantitatively, so we tend to overlook them. But we've all experienced that as people, both being the ones who have inadvertently been rude in that way and also have been on the receiving end of another person's rudeness.
Christine is a great advocate of the power of boredom, a concept that the ubiquity of digital devices has almost rendered redundant. Here she sings the virtues of giving our brains a break from the constant stream of stimulation by embracing fallow time. Now, you use a lovely word several times already, boredom. Living a mediated life provides us very few opportunities to be bored, and you say in the book that unmediated interstitial time is going extinct. Could you sing the virtues of boredom a little bit more to us?
Yes, my sons who are about to turn 19, when they were younger, would roll their eyes every time I went on one of these rants. But those of us who grew up before mobile technology was in widespread use could take for granted that we would be bored. And I remember my parents, I would complain about boredom. They'd say, go outside and play, go find something to do. And at the time I was disgruntled and annoyed because shouldn't they be solving this problem for me? But of course they were doing the right thing, which is saying, no, you will spend your entire life trying to fill your time and you have a limited amount of it. And boredom is a useful thing to experience because you can do a number of things. You can be annoyed the whole time and then just get over it. You can find something to do, and that would require agency on your part and thoughtfulness. You can also just let your mind wander, something that we also don't let happen. Mind wandering, as we know, particularly from the history of science and invention, is an extremely creative and useful process that those parts of your brain that otherwise would be distracted come to the surface. It's why shower thoughts are a thing, because we're doing something routine. We're not really thinking. And boom, we remember, oh no, my friend's birthday was last week and I forgot it, or something like that. Those ideas and thoughts surface at those times because we've given our brains a break from constant stimulation. And daydreaming, which nowadays sounds like something from the 19th century, but should be something we embrace as well. We have to now actively choose those moments of fallow time because it's the de facto rule now to fill time, even with little games, little things on the screen. And people used to smoke. They used to have some people knit. There are things you can do to occupy yourself physically in moments of boredom, but those still free your mind. The way we deal with boredom, even those tiny little seconds at stoplights, you see people pick up their phone now, sitting on the bus, waiting for a friend to come for a dinner and they're 10 minutes late. Look up, look around, have look up moments. This is a big theme for me because we spend so much time looking down at our phones or looking at screens. Look up, look around, you'll notice something. It's once you start doing it, you realize how rare it's become in your daily life. And I think for a lot of people, I've given this task to myself and to my friends many times, go an entire day and don't pick up your phone during those interstitial moments. Just don't do it. Look around, bring a book, do something, anything but the phone, and see how you feel at the end of that day. See if your perspective has shifted even a tiny bit about your world. Most people will find that it does. Not always for the better. A friend of mine who did the experiment was complaining to me the next day. She's like, all I did is notice how terribly people dress on the subway. I was like, this was not the goal. She's very judgmental, but she was noticing though. She was looking around at other people. And I think that at least I chalk that up as a victory.
Yeah, you're so right about doing things where it's impossible to be disrupted as being a real help for enabling the subconscious mind to pop those kind of joining old and old together to make something new. I'm not sure this counts as mediated. I've for a long time had waterproof crayons in the shower for the very reason that when an insight hits you and you think it might be, you need to capture it. You don't want to have the Paul McCartney experience. It said that Paul McCartney wrote Yesterday 3 times, each one of them in a dream, and the first two he didn't write it down. The third time took it a long time to come. But and it's interesting. I do a lot of work with with creative communication, commercial communication businesses, and all of the. I think without exception, all of those who work in the strategic planning function, in the function where you are taking multiple different data sources and you're looking to blend them and to find some area of insight or understanding about an audience or a market or whatever it might be, all of them either run or swim in particular, and swim somewhere where you cannot possibly be interrupted by a bleep or a bing, is incredibly important. As someone who's been calling himself a data storyteller for more than a decade now, I'm always interested to come across others from often radically different domains who advocate the power of blending narrative and numbers, stories and statistics. Earlier this year, I was struck by the power, eloquence and simplicity of an article in the Royal Society of Arts RSA journal titled How to Get Trust in Science. Its author is scientist turned journalist Caitlyn Looby, today the Great Lakes reporter at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. To engage the public meaningfully in often very complex scientific research and findings, Caitlyn has an elegant three-part strategy for researchers. Get local, ditch the jargon, and find the story in the data. Here, Caitlyn details her own journey from scientific research to more effective scientific communication. Can you tell us how you pivoted from scientific research to science communication? Had you become frustrated by some scientists' inability to communicate effectively with the public? What was it that motivated you and drove you to take this new path?
Yeah, so I think it was something, that was always going to happen. It was kind of a slow transition, but I've always really loved writing. When I was growing up, I was super, super shy. And writing was kind of the best way that I knew to express myself. So it's something that I always really loved and enjoyed. And I kind of always described myself not as a scientist who was trying to write, but as a writer who happened to be doing science. And I would say, like, by the time that I got into grad school, I was always finding excuses to write. So I would apply for every grant, every fellowship, just because I wanted an opportunity just to write and tell science stories. And for me, science communication really started out in terms of outreach. So, like, going into communities, especially when I was down in the tropics, having conversations, even writing some one-off clips about, the communities and like the great work that they were doing. And then that slowly just started transitioning. It was like one clip, then another, and then that turned into one internship, and then another and another and another. And it really just started realizing that, like, that was probably a better career path for me and something that not only really excited me, but I realized too throughout the process of doing science that I didn't want to really just talk to scientists about science. I wanted to talk to everybody about science and kind of like help pique people's curiosity and sense of wonder. And I talk a lot about what scientists can do better. But also too, like, I say that with a really large caveat, that's kind of really constrained by academia and like higher ups in terms of these organizations. And I remember very specifically in one of the last years of grad school, we had a seminar and somebody came in and they were talking about science communication. And one of the women who was in the cohort below me, she made a comment and it really struck me. She said something along the lines of, okay, not only are we supposed to do science, we're supposed to do field work, we're supposed to do lab work, we're supposed to be experts in stats, we're supposed to do all these different things. And then you also want us to do science communication. So when I talk about scientists, in terms of science communication and whatnot, I say that with a large caveat that not every scientist needs to be doing science communication. Not everyone is suited for everything. And there's so many things that scientists are expected to do, especially now. So, when I talk about this, it's very much with a lot of grace when it comes to scientists and knowing that, like, you could be working 80 hours a week and like adding something else to your toolkit is not always plausible.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. My business partner runs a consultancy that works with academics to find and express the real world impact of the work that they're doing, not just how many papers they're giving, but an impact is increasingly used. I know in the States as well as UK and around the world, genuine impact is increasingly used as a proper measure of what scientific progress is being made and social scientific progress. And very often academics saying, I've got to do this as well. It's like just troweling it on. She also offers a very helpful and informed perspective on the role and potential impact of AI in scientific communication, as a starting point rather than the be-all and the end. From what you've observed, I know people might maintain that artificial intelligence has only existed since November or October 2022. We know it's been around for many, many years more. But from what you've observed since the mass availability of AI tools in the past 3 years, of large language models like ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini, among thousands of others, do you think these are helping scientists to communicate more or less clearly than before?
I think it could definitely be helpful, but I think I say that also with a caveat that, it used to be that, at least when I was going through school, that like Wikipedia was kind of the bad guy in terms of like, you don't want to use that in terms of your assignments and whatnot. And then kind of people came around to it. And I feel like AI has become that thing as well. But I think just like Wikipedia, in terms of science communication, it should be used as a starting point and not the be all end all. Because, if you type in something to Chat GPT and say, I'm giving a talk to a local audience and this is what it is, like, think about key talking points. What's going to happen is you're not going to have your personality in there. And if your personality isn't in there, then you're not going to connect. It's going to come off as disingenuous, which a lot of people already feel like science is. And otherwise, it's just kind of going to be another version of a PowerPoint presentation. So I think it can definitely be used in terms of like, trying to think of analogies or other ways to say things, or, just like getting some ideas. But again, it should really only be a starting point, because when it comes to science communication, like, your personality needs to be in there. A big part of science communication is this need to humanize science and scientists and what they do. So, if you're just taking what you get off the internet or something like AI, you're just going to sound like a different version of a robot, basically. So I think it's important to maybe use, but again, like, just a big part of science communication is like, you can say something wrong, you can say something a little silly or stupid, and like, but just correct it and like make it just like a conversation in the way that, everybody else does when they're having a conversation with their friends or whatnot.
I think you raise a really interesting point. In the previous season, we had a couple of guests, a French philosopher of law, and also a data scientist, who were talking about one thing that is currently massively lacking in the answers that large language models give, which is what they both termed humility markers. So if you ask an LLM to structure you a presentation to give about soil microbes to a local community, it'll come out with a structure for you, and it will mine the world, and it'll find your work, your journalism and your published academic work, and it will, it'll do the convergent thinking bit. But it won't say, I don't really know, or it won't say, I'm not sure, or it won't say, it could be this. It will give you a definitive answer. I mean, you can question it and you can push back, and it might say, good point. But there are no markers of humility. There's this absolute certainty. And I think it's fair to say that most people, even though there are now, adverts for prompt engineers, which was something that nobody would have heard of 3 years ago, maybe, or most people wouldn't have done. but most people aren't terribly good at writing detailed prompts. But also, most LLMs don't have any humility about them at all. There's none of that human-like. I'm not really certain. There's absolute certainty in it. So I think good advice, a good starting point, but your own personality and empathy and knowing the audience. Again, your point about knowing the audience, so right.
Well, hello there. It's your host Sam here. Now, I won't keep you for long. If you've been inspired by what you've been listening to today, and you'd like to find out what type of data storyteller you are, why not go to our Data Storytelling Scorecard? Just follow the link to data-storytelling.scoreapp.com. That's Score App with 2 P's. Answer 12 simple questions, and you'll instantly be served with a scorecard that tells you exactly what type of data storyteller you are. Now, back to the action and our brilliant guest.
Season 8 also featured 3 practitioners of the smarter use of data from radically different working environments: customer experience in the automotive industry, public relations, and football management. In a first for Data Malarkey, we recorded our first episode live on stage. At the invitation of Andrew Thomas, founder of Craven Hill Publishing and the impresario behind the Data Comms Conference and Awards Programme, it was my very great pleasure to talk to Nick Ratcliffe, Customer Experience Director of Volkswagen UK. We were second up, I think, at the Data Comms Conference back in May 2025. Nick talks to us about the amorphous concept of insight and how he empowers his teams to move from data to insight, and also how he helps them anchor data-driven insights to business performance. The word insight, I think it's fair to say, is thrown about by many in marketing like confetti. For me, insight is rare and it's hard-won, and it's well described as being this profound and useful understanding. It's profound because it answers the question, so what? This is what the data mean. Your example there, excellent example from the R8 for the TT. But allowing us to go on and look at the much more interesting question, now what? This is what we should do as a result. In your career in telecoms, but obviously mostly in automotive, have you got frustrated by what's often presented as insight? Question 1. And then question 2, how do you get your teams to get to genuinely actionable insights about your North Star, which is obviously your customers?
Yeah, I think you're right. Insight's one of those, bit like strategy, it's one of those overused words that's just appended to something to try and give it some credibility. And it seems to be overused at both ends of the telescope. So on the one hand, you'll just get a massive data dump and someone says, here's our insight. And it's kind of, no, that's just a load of information. Where's the insight? To the other end, where people at the operational end of the business are saying that insight isn't actionable. And I think what they mean really is, you haven't told me exactly what to do. And it's kind of somewhere in the middle that, real insight lists, which I suppose is, it needs to be truthful. It needs to be new. And you need to be able to use it. So there's no point having some incredible insight that you can't act on. But I think it's kind of, at what point does the data and insight team need to hand things over and say, look, we've identified a potential solution here, but it's over to you guys in the operational parts of the business to actually work out what conversation are you going to have with that particular retailer. We don't need to do the whole job for them.
Often there can be a lost in translation kind of moment, or indeed kind of culture that exists between those that are knee deep in data and insight and analytics and maybe traditionally marketing, working across all of those different domains that you have at VW across the 6 marks. Is there anything in particular, any way of leading in particular that you work to stop those lost in translation?
Yeah, I think when I took over this team, it's just over 5 years ago now, talking to the internal customers, quite a lot of the feedback was, your team are doing some really interesting stuff, but we're not really sure why. And I think there was that disconnect between recognized business need and what the data analytics team were actually doing. And some of it was lost in translation. Some of it was genuine hobby horse following from the data team, doing what they could rather than what was needed. So yeah, I think a lot of it was ensuring that my team were getting really much more into the weeds of what the operational teams were looking for, and taking people on a journey step by step. Often stuff that was being taken for granted was actually where the value was lying, and people were trying to get into, oh yeah, but cutting edge new tool, exciting magpie type behavior, rather than saying actually what the business needs is just some pretty useful stuff that can start to move the needle.
Reining in that the inner Doug, the dog from the Pixar movie Up. Squirrel. Very important to be doing that. Nick goes on to talk about the switch in the balance of rational and emotional decision-making required in the move from petrol vehicles to electric vehicles, and about the issues of range anxiety and charge point availability. I know there's an awful lot talked about our decision making, the work of Daniel Kahneman and others in terms of making decisions emotionally, justifying them rationally, and so on. I want to talk a little bit more about that in the context of electric vehicles. And I know that your data shows that moving from internal combustion engine to EVs is not like moving from one car mark to the other. It's like a whole shift in, I think you described a whole shift in operating system that makes decision making more conscious, more rational, more deliberative, more system one versus system
exactly.
two. Does that shift that everyone's going to have to make mean that the mental shortcut of brands and brandings is less important, or is going to have to change?
I don't think it has to change, but it's definitely having less impact on that. So, the traditional car buying model is that everyone's walking around with a kind of mental shortlist of vehicles and brands that they could potentially see themselves in. And the marketing effort was really about trying to latch onto that and drive somebody through that shortlisting process. Moving to an EV, there are far more considerations to be made. I've just talked about one, which is charging. And can it work in terms of my lifestyle? So it becomes a far more deliberate, cognitive process, more steps, more jobs to be done. And it's adding more friction. And therefore that sort of mental shortcut of these are the brands that are on my radar is disrupted. And we've seen some of the traditional divisions in the market, mass market brands, premium brands, that's being broken. So that we've seen people buying the Skoda Enyaq coming in from Mercedes, coming in from BMW, coming across from Audi, from our own portfolio, because people are looking at the products in their own right and being less driven by that sort of previously established. These are the sort of brands I work with.
Let alone the role of range anxiety, which soon passes. But I'm intrigued that I'm not aware in this country or elsewhere any campaigns that have addressed the emotional aspect of range anxiety that new EV drivers often have.
Yeah, although again, the insight we have now is range anxiety is less of an issue. It's now charge point availability anxiety. And overlaying that, a much greater concern amongst female drivers around public charging and the risks to them and their family around running out of charge. It's a massive sort of gender divide in terms of propensity.
Darryl Sparey is that rarest of creatures, someone who works in public relations who A, has a good grasp of data, who B, applies this to his evidence-based, data-driven agency, Hard Numbers. Darryl talks first about why brand search on Google is a really good proxy for brand awareness and the critical role of SEO in understanding PR impact. You spied an opportunity in search engine optimization that you've bought. Before we talk about your databasing approach, can you just talk about what you saw in SEO and how and why that inspired you to build the measurement models that you use to measure marketing comms impact?
Yeah. So that sort of the inspiration behind moving from what was PR measurement when I was at Precise and having a network of people that I knew that were predominantly PR and professional communicators, moving into SEO, I looked and I thought the PR folk in most companies, if you think about if you look across all of the companies that there are in the UK, right? Most companies aren't Nike or Microsoft or, huge, corporations. They're smaller than that. For most companies, if they have a in-house PR communicator, or if they have someone who's managing that function, they're unlikely to be spending huge amounts of money above the line, right? Like, they're probably not making those kind of massive, investments or whatever. So a lot of like brand awareness, like that you could attribute to PR. And if you think that for most, actually a really good proxy for brand awareness is brand search on Google. Like, I am more honest with Google than anything or anyone, right? Google knows everything about me. So anything I'm looking for, any brand I'm searching, anything like that, right? It's definitely going into Google. So I think brand search is a proxy for brand awareness. PR folks should sort of own and be the custodians of brand search within their business. And then for SEO and for like really leave SEO to kind of be the purview of generic search, right? Like getting the site, if you're Microsoft, you want to rank for Microsoft and Office and all the rest of it. But you also want to rank for, document automation systems or, whatever workflow tools or whatever they would describe the category of their product as. So thinking about it as that kind of brand versus generic kind of split. So I got really excited by the opportunity of generic, like, that kind of generic side of things and understanding how do you, rank a business for this stuff and all the rest of it. But the more and more I learned about SEO, the more it brought me back to PR and communications. And that was because you see, we worked with a client that was getting 220,000 searches a month just for their brand name, right? And then they rebranded and destroyed, like they never got above 65,000 searches a month after they did this rebrand, because they could never spend enough money to get that level of brand search and all the rest of it. And so they kind of like destroyed their business over it. There was lots of other competitive things that affected it and all the rest of it. But that really led me to thinking the brand, and you see it time and again, the brands that are killing it online are the ones that have really high levels of brand search. The example that most people would cite would be like an Airbnb. People now search for Airbnb. They go to Airbnb to find, where they want to go. They used to search hotel, Tenerife, and then look through, what was, whatever came up on Google as a result of that. So that was kind of what I kind of learned from being in the SEO industry. The other thing about learning from being in the SEO industry was they're very happy to be associated with a commercial target in a way that PR people often aren't. They're very happy to talk money, numbers, to think in terms of, how they could potentially deliver some form of, revenue increase or things like that for their clients by improving how they rank for generics or, whatever. They also invest a lot more in tools. Too many PR agencies and in-house PR teams try to go down that. I just want one tool for everything. I want one, and actually you see the benefit of having a number of different tools and the different data points that you can get from those different tools just give you a platform to find opportunities to demonstrate the impact of the work that you're doing. If you think about so the volume of traffic overall to the site didn't increase, but the split from generic search versus brand search increased. So you were getting more search from generic than you were from brand, right? So then you've got a data point to give you then the SEO side of things did really well because we were driving more traffic from generic than brand, right? And that also tells us we have an opportunity to improve, because you can just scale brand linearly, right? You can just keep going and going and going with brand, right? So we have an opportunity to invest and drive more from brand, right? Just simple stuff like that. Like just if as a PR person, all you do is report on reach, volume, and not a lot else, it's not giving you the opportunity to find that broader impact that you might have had on the business or on your client or or the organization that you're representing.
Oftentimes during the digital revolution, the PR industry has missed the boat and failed to invest in and capitalize upon the opportunities provided by data and technology. Beyond SEO, which public relations gave up without a fight to media agencies, Darryl is convinced in the age of AI that GEO, that's generative engine optimization, is a tool that PRs must embrace, or else find themselves redundant and out of role. Thinking about AI, what's your perspective on the role that AI can and no doubt already is playing in your business, but in the business of better measurement and evaluation of the impact of marketing communications?
Yeah, I think it's probably in sort of three areas. I think AI represents the biggest opportunity for the PR industry of anything in my 25 years of applying my trade so far, but it also represents the biggest threat, and there's no getting around that. So I think what you've got to do is think about, okay, well, what are the things that I can focus on and that we can focus on to maximize to the upside and to move us away from exposure potentially to the downside, right? So AI has amazing the ability to bring multiple data sources together and then query them in natural language is incredibly valuable, right? Like that is super cool. And I think that's, and you can make sense of data at a scale like never before. So I think that's one key thing. Another key thing is around being able to create products and services to enable us to do things like more quickly, basically, and better, basically make us better at our craft. And we're basically going through a process at the moment of understanding key processes or key things in our business and then thinking, can we build a point solution? We're not trying to create a platform to automate all of PR or anything like that. But if you atomize key tasks, and you talked about media list and making media lists relevant to particular journalists and things like that, thinking about, that's a very repetitive thing that people do, right? Within an agency that you should, if you've got any sense about it, you have a lot of that historical data. We do, because we've got the CRM system. So a lot of our thinking has been around, okay, well, let's take that as a repetitive task that is very data based, but that we can basically build something around to make it quicker and easier for people to do something. So we've got something that we're working on internally, and that hopefully wouldn't bang some of the kinks out of it or whatever, and then potentially make it available commercially after that. And the fact that we can code our own products, is amazing. I mean, my business partner Paul spent a weekend and he basically built a working beta of something, which is insane. I mean, you'd have to have spent thousands of pounds in software development costs previously. So that's super exciting. And then the other piece is GEO, generative engine optimization. I've written a primer on it. I'll share a link to it with you if it's helpful. Because the PR industry missed the SEO boat in 2012 to 2020, and I don't think we should miss this GEO boat. So bit.ly/GEO4PR. I'll send you the link after this, Sam. But it's a long form primer for PR people to understand what generative engine optimization is, what they need to do, and we're going to be building out more content in relation to that and making that available for folks, because we want in-house PR teams who are our clients, and hopefully there'll be more of them in future, to be able to make the case that they should be owning that activity internally. So I think GEO represents a huge opportunity for us as an industry too, because so much of the content, our research showed that 61% of all content about the world's 100 biggest brands on ChatGPT cites editorial sources, right? And I've seen study after study of the ones that are worth looking at, anywhere between 60 and 75% of that content comes from editorial media. So we have this huge opportunity, because the stuff that generative engines use to answer queries in relation to companies, our clients, the businesses and organizations we represent, is sourced from editorial media. So it really puts us in a really important place.
And last but not least is Mark Bonner, the Director of Football at Cambridge United Football Club. Mark pulls back the Wizard of Oz curtain to tell us about the use of data and statistics in professional football today. But as a manager in the modern professional game, what sort of access to data and statistics do you have about players' performance in training, during live games, post-match analysis? And to what extent does that guide the decisions that you make?
Well, I think it might be relative to the level that you're at. So obviously the top clubs would have incredible amount of resource in every area, and data will be one of them. And as always, anything that goes on at the top filters its way down and finds its way to other clubs. So I think, for example, in the times I've been in doing this role or head coach role, the use of data has grown, the availability of data has grown, and the number of providers for such data has grown hugely. And the amount that you can capture, and almost every area from the moment you walk in to the moment you leave can be tracked, recorded, analysed. We have to be careful not to overload people with that. I think that's very important in a pressured environment, that we put too much of that and people try to become experts in data rather than experts in the game. And there's a fine line between that, certainly for players. So I think that's something to consider. But as manager, I think ultimately you're always trying as the manager to find every area you can where you can improve, any way you can make the boat go faster, any way you can help score a win. That is it. So I think you're asking of the small team of people that you work with to bring you solutions and ideas and challenge your thinking all the time. And part of the skill of the workforce is to know what stuff matters and what stuff is interesting but irrelevant. And sometimes I think in a short paced time, you haven't got long to turn a game plan around and get ready for the next game. So I think there's certain things that are an element of data might help you right now, immediately, and something can be parked because it's part of a bigger picture or a longer term goal. And prioritizing what you use when becomes important. But from my perspective as a head coach, or even in the role now, we would be able to track the physical side of the game in terms of the output of the players, every individual, and then the collective. And that is a really interesting piece of work that a lot of our performance and sports science departments would use to track and measure players' training loads and see how that then influences the next game and the next training session. So that side of it is a huge part of the game. And then you've got the performance data, so everyone's individual output in terms of the basic statistics that you'd see on every TV show, possession, and the new one, XG, that you'll see all the time. And then beneath that, there are so many layers. And then it's about being disciplined enough to say, what's the stuff that really matters to us? And I always think with data and with anything, if you know what the end point that you're aiming for is, then you can evaluate against that. Otherwise, you've just got numbers, you'll throw them out, people analyze them, but they're not necessarily the ones that really matter. So it's really important to have that internal, first, the discipline to stick to the stuff that matters to you, but actually clarity, conviction, and idea and vision at the beginning that says, this is what good is for us. And then you can judge against that, rather than here's a load of numbers, pick out the good or the bad. Because you can find data, can't you, to shape any story. And it's trying to make sure that you've got that real clarity, I think, first of all.
That's brilliant. Now, when you're kind of in the game as it is now, there's a. I mean, I'm thinking of the games that I watch. You see the all the different kind of management staff and some people with their set piece coaches. They've been really kind of under the spotlight this year. Are you able to track if a player is having a dip in form actually in real time during the game, or is that something that's only done by the super elite clubs?
Yeah. So what can we track in real time? The physical data is there, so you can see section by section, is someone dropping off for any reason. But that is a standalone figure. Maybe you have to consider how often's the ball been in play, what's the context of the game. So I don't know, the distance that you cover or the high speeds that you run can be will hugely be linked to how often the ball is in play. So the ball in play time in the Premier League is much, much higher than it is in League Two, for example. And from game to game, you can see quite a big swing. The average ball in play time in League Two last year would have been around 48 of the 90 minutes. In the Premier League, it will be probably above 60. So that will have a huge, obvious link to, number one, how many restarts there are, how many transitions there are, and what is capable to cover in terms of physical distance within a game. Likewise, if we were to play a game where we were the dominant team with the ball, we regained the ball as high up the pitch as possible, that would look very different physically from a game that was very transitional and complete counter-attack, end-to-end basketball type, versus a game where you are defending low in the pitch, you can't get out your half, you actually move side to side loads, but you don't cover much distance because you don't travel very far. So sometimes the context of the game needs to be considered, not just that number in isolation. So the physical side of the game is really easy to track. Now, obviously in levels that, in real time, Sky TV will put so many measures up when they're watching the game of some of the performance indicators. We don't have access to that sort of information live. Many of the big clubs will, and that is something I think that rolls out again. But again, it's like, what's the stuff that really matters in that moment, and being guided by that. But also, I think the very, very best practitioners have a brilliant eye. The very best analysts, the very best coaches will have a really good eye and will be able to see the game as it is and read the behavior of the players and understand where motivation is and have a real good idea of momentum. And all those things can play a part. So I think it's a combination of all those things again.
So there we have it. The usual mashup, potpourri and mouse mix-up of guests from many, many different walks of life. A kaleidoscope of professions. But all of them making smarter use of data. And all of them realizing both the potentials and the limitations, the pluses and the minuses of relying too heavily on the rational, in the form of data and AI, and too lightly on the emotion, in the form of humanity, empathy, and understanding that data and AI are useful but only in the human context. Thanks so much to Season 8's guests, to Nick, Mark and Caitlyn, to Chris, Christine and Darryl. Thank you for agreeing to appear on the podcast and for all the work that you, your colleagues and organisations have done to help share and promote the episodes with your communities. That helps so much to extend our reach. Thanks also to our growing army of listeners, streamers, and particularly our subscribers. There are thousands of you now, particularly strong progress on YouTube, and together you all make our job of finding guests, interviewing them, and promoting the episodes on social media more rewarding. Knowing so many of you are listening makes it all worthwhile. As ever, any suggestions for guests? If you think you'd make a good guest, or you work with someone who'd tell a great story about how they make smarter use of data, drop us an email at hello@usingdatasmarter.com or complete the application form at https://www.usingdatasmarter.com/guest. I look forward to welcoming you back for more data-driven common sense soon, with the Data Malarkey podcast dropping every other Wednesday on Apple, Spotify and YouTube Music. And video episodes go live a week later on our YouTube channel at Data Malarkey. See you again soon.